Hello everyone! So in a previous video I mentioned that I am heavily influenced by fantasy and sci-fi, and although it's not my main subject in my art, I always try to find a way to incorporate a little bit of fantasy into my work, and a lot of times it manifests itself in the colors that I choose or the way that I draw trees especially. But occasionally I go full into the fantasy realm, and I like to paint a subject that I call forest spirits. I've done a bunch of them over the years, so I wanted to take you on a little journey into my fantasy world and show you how I think about this fantasy world, how I incorporate it into my landscapes, and just give you a little insight into the process. I hope you enjoy the ride. For as long as I can remember, I have been a forest girl. It might be because I grew up in upstate New York and spent most of my time outside. And then I spent 10 years in Denver exploring the amazing Rocky Mountains. But I don't think I truly understood that affection or longing until I moved to Scotland. The forests of Scotland are truly special. And of course there are plenty of forests around the world that I'm sure are amazing, but there's a certain energy here that makes me feel completely at peace. And in retrospect, I can see how much this has influenced my art over the years. If you've been following me for a while on Twitch or social media, you may have heard me talk about the forest year at some point. In 2018, I decided to give myself a little project. I decided I would spend at least 1 hour in the forest every week for an entire year. And of course I would try to go for more than an hour, but sometimes life gets busy and you can't always do what you want. I decided I would document the year with video and photography and writing and art, and then at the end of the year just sit down and see what I had. But of course, something much deeper happened. My spirit was truly awakened during that year. It wasn't just about fulfilling my quota of being in the forest. It quickly became a need. And that was when I truly embraced the practice of forest therapy, or Shinrin-yoku. I made a whole video about this recently that you can check out if you're interested. Along the way, I was discovering some truly incredible beings in the forest. Not only animals, but also specific trees in specific forests have come to be true characters in my art. The perfect example of this is when I made a children's book about being a tree. So now that you know a little bit about why I like to paint forests, let's talk about the Forest Spirit series, which is definitely an ongoing, possibly never-ending series in my life. Now, most of you know I love painting landscapes. That is super obvious if you've watched any of my videos. And as I mentioned, I have been influenced by fantasy, storytelling, and sci-fi kind of stuff throughout my life. So I get a lot of joy in incorporating that into my artwork. I want to infuse a bit of storytelling into my paintings. And of course, the first thing that pops into my head is the forest. These forest spirit pieces have become my own version of celebrating the magic that I discover in the forests. If I thought that I could make a living off of painting forest spirit pieces, I would probably pursue that. But I have to stay grounded for now and do what works for me. However, when I have a little bit of extra time, I'm always thinking about these forest spirits. Maybe because as I spend more time in the forests, I feel like these forest spirits are coming along with me. I can't see them, but I know they're there. In my artwork, they take on the appearance of dragon-like creatures, which is definitely inspired by the fact that so often I think I see creatures crawling through the forest, and it turns out to be some kind of cool tree or root system. They are usually somewhat transparent or spirit-like, and they often are incorporated into the forest, like coming out of a tree or wrapping around some ferns or anything that makes it feel like they're part of the forest. So, of course, in order to paint that, I need to observe lots of forest details. And as I continue to grow my skills in painting landscapes, I'm always thinking about the details. This has required a lot of observation in the forest, and I'm talking like up close and personal with these little teeny tiny bits of the forest. Moss, fungus, lichen, bark, you name it. I'm staring at it like as close as I can, taking close-up videos, observing it, sketching it, painting it, and it's become a bit of an obsession. As I paint these forest spirit scenes, I'm thinking about how can I make each one a little bit different. I want each one to be unique. So I usually focus on a different piece or detail of the forest. For instance, in this new piece, I'm thinking about mushrooms, glowing mushrooms growing everywhere, and the forest spirit itself became more of a mushroom sprite in a way. As I sit down to paint these scenes, I never know exactly how they're going to turn out. I have a general idea, but along the way, something always surprises me. It's like the forest spirit is coming alive in front of me and telling its own story. This usually leads to the most interesting results. If I sit down and plan every single little aspect, my paintings feel dead to me. But if I let them evolve as I paint, they become alive. They become something so unique, and I learn so much that way because I'm experimenting with something brand new. This is actually the reason I choose to use watercolor and gouache for my forest spirit pieces, because it allows me to sort of harness that spontaneity. If you've ever used watercolor, you know how unpredictable it can be. Yes, you can sort of guide it to do what you want, but for the most part, especially in the background part of my forest spirit scenes, I'm letting it do whatever it wants. I'm letting it go crazy. I love to start off with a very wet into wet wash of color and salt. The salt is what gives it that intense, crazy texture. And although I go into the painting knowing my general composition, sometimes as I see this finished result of the salt wash, I start to see bits and pieces coming forth, like trees and ferns and all sorts of stuff emerge from that crazy abstract background, and I just go with it. So this might influence where certain trees are placed or how the forest spirit will even look in the end. For instance, in this piece, the salt wash ended up looking like a forest spirit to me, so I just painted around some of those salty textures. It's definitely a really fun way to work, and I think that's why I especially love these pieces, because I can be totally free. I'm simply letting the forest speak through me in these paintings. In terms of technical process, I will usually start off with a very thin, transparent layer in the beginning, like laying in the majority of the trees or major shapes, and then I'll slowly build up the opacity with the gouache. I love how gouache and watercolor work together. They are like brother and sister. It's perfect. And if I happen to mess up any of the details with the gouache, it's really easy to erase it with a bit of water and shift things around. However, because of my process of slowly layering up all the details, these pieces take so long. Usually a forest spirit painting will take me about 60 hours. I think I mentioned in a previous video that this forest spirit piece started out as a commission request. In the end, it was no longer needed for that commission, so I embraced it as my own piece, and I've been spending upwards of about 30 hours on it so far. That is not feasible as a commission. If someone were to commission me to paint a forest spirit piece in the way that I like to paint them, it would cost a ridiculous amount of money just based on time alone. But of course, I can do a more minimal version of a forest spirit painting. It just depends on the needs. I'm really not interested in painting hyper-realistic forests or even really, really detailed realistic forests unless there's something more to it. Like, for instance, in these paintings, obviously, I'm embracing my love of fantasy and storytelling. In a normal landscape, I don't really do that quite as much. I simply try to capture the atmosphere of that particular scene, and I enjoy it, but it's not quite as interesting to me in the end. So that's why it's really easy for me to spend a ridiculous amount of time painting these. Sadly, that means I don't get to paint that many of them because it's not my full-time job to paint these forest spirit paintings. I just am able to do them in whatever spare time I can find, or, if I can shave off a few hours of sleep, I'll sometimes do that. So a bit of advice for anyone out there who wants to start a series or even just do one piece that leans a little bit more towards fantasy or imaginative realism, as James Gurney called it in his famous book. First of all, I'd say it's best to start with observation. Choose a subject that you absolutely love. Maybe it's a coastal scene or an underwater world, or perhaps it's a desert scene with big reptilian beasts. Who knows? As long as it's something you're passionate about, you won't mind all of the time and dedication that is needed to researching and observing that type of scene. If you're adding any kind of animal or beast into the painting, I think it's important to study the anatomy of a similar being that exists in our reality. So for instance, for my forest spirits, I often look at reptiles and sometimes even birds. But a lot of times it just comes down to experimentation in the sketchbook. There are tons of resources online nowadays for how to paint certain fantasy creatures. You can probably find dozens of references on Pinterest or just a quick Google search. So just start by collecting some general information for yourself and start to familiarize yourself with those aspects of the painting that maybe are a bit foreign to you. For my forest spirit pieces, I truly believe that all of my time that I spend studying landscapes is a huge help to painting these the way I want to paint them. Not only in understanding the colors and the values, but the structure and the form, and just creating really cool compositions in general. All of that comes from my endless amount of hours studying landscapes. By the way, I do sell prints of my Forest Spirit series over on my Etsy shop. There are a couple different sizes, and currently this is pretty much the only way to get your hands on one. So what I want to leave you with is one of my favorite quotes, something that inspires me to keep going on my passion projects, even when I feel like I don't have any time. But in the end, it's always worth it. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. And of course, I'd love to hear about your passion projects if you want to leave a comment. Take care, everyone. I'll see you soon.